So if you're listening to this podcast in the week that it's released, then you may have clocked that it is Trump's 100th day in office this week. And to mark that occasion, we'll be speaking to Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Ruth is a professor of history and Italian studies at New York University and writes about fascism, authoritarianism, and propaganda. Her 2020 book, Strongmen, From Mussolini to the Present, was a bestseller. It examines how illiberal leaders use corruption, violence, propaganda, and machismo to stay in power, and how people stand up to and resist them. For somewhat obvious reasons, Ruth's expertise is in high demand these days, and so it really is a pleasure to have her join the podcast. Ruth, thank you so much for being here.
Pleased to be here.
So, Ruth, this week it's 100 days of Trump's second term. What's your opinion about where we stand? Is America now an autocracy? How far down the road of authoritarianism has America gone? And what do you make of the Trump regime, Trump administration so far?
So today, when there are fewer one-party states like China and North Korea, many of them are communist, it can be harder to say that a nation is an autocracy because today, as in even Russia or Turkey or Hungary, you keep elections going, you could have multiple parties, and yet you slowly chip away at democratic institutions and norms. And certainly that is what is happening in the United States, but it is happening at top speed. We are 100 days in this week, and I can tell you that the amount of damage that is being done to the democratic system, to the rule of law, to democratic norms of accountability, to the rights of the people, due process when you're arrested, all of these things that make up the legal and institutional structure of democracy. If you look at the early months of even Putin in Russia or Erdogan or other autocrats, they don't resemble this. They move much more slowly. So one significant thing is that this is the speed at which these changes are happening, the destruction of government, the paralyzing of government services and agencies through Elon Musk's Doge. This resembles what you see after a coup, not after what happened in the States when, Donald Trump came to power after a legal election. So it's quite extraordinary. That's one thing that is, for me, as a scholar of authoritarianism, past and present, it really stands out, the speed of execution.
Why do you think it's happened so fast?
Well, it is a pattern when somebody has been in power before and then they had to leave. And as we all know, Donald Trump tried the autocratic maneuver of a self-coup. He tried not to leave, but it didn't work. When they do come back, if they're able to come back, they're full of vengeance and they tend to be much more extreme. We see this with Netanyahu in Israel. They tend to be much more desperate to shut down anything that can harm them. So that's one thing. The other is that they used their time out of office during the Joe Biden years brilliantly. They had what I was calling at the time a kind of shadow government, which was Project 2025, shepherded by the Heritage Foundation, which came up during those years when they were out of office with a whole playbook, even training political operatives to, go into civil service. Trump also kept his personality cult amazingly robust, considering he is not young and he was out of power for some years and also disgraced. He's a convicted felon. And yet he was able, because of Fox News and his media control, even being out of power, to give the impression that to many of his most devoted followers, you could say his most deluded followers, that he was actually still in charge. And this was because he denied that he lost the 2020 election. So all of these things, and there are many more, made it so that when January 20th came around, they were ready to go. And here we go back to, they were ready to go on an enterprise that does not resemble democratic governance. It resembles authoritarian takeover at the speed of light, or you could say the speed of coup.
So at what point does America stop being a democracy, and how far away from that are we now?
So it's always a continuum, and it's really interesting if you look around the world comparatively. For example, in Turkey, where Erdogan has been, after the coup against him in 2016, there's an ongoing crackdown where hundreds of thousands of people were detained. Opposition party mayors have been removed from their positions, and this is mostly Kurdish mayors, long before he did what then in March led people to say now it's an autocracy, and that is to keep his main rival, Ekrem Imamoglu, from actually being able to run for president because he would probably beat him in 2028. Erdogan actually arrested Imamoglu, and along with 100 other high officials from the main opposition party. And so it's very interesting that in Turkey, many people said, okay, now we're an autocracy. Whereas looking from abroad, I was already referring to Turkey as an autocracy. That's just to tell you that it's difficult to isolate one thing. However, there is every indication that we are becoming an autocracy in the United States, arresting judges, deporting people to foreign countries without due process, just lying to the public, taking down public agencies, wrecking governance. And really what is happening with Elon Musk is that he's been allowed to kind of colonize and infiltrate the government of a sovereign power in order to re-engineer government to protect himself and his companies. So that's also an innovation. That's a whole other thing going on that's very confusing to people. And so all of this does not resemble democratic governance in the least, as well as the corruption of Trump having his own meme coin. And every day there's new, what we call corruption vehicles being created with no accountability. So all of the democratic norms have already been shredded. Now, there is significant pushback, especially litigation. And so someone could say, well, you've got litigation, you've got lawyers able to operate, so it's not an autocracy. But in the new world of the 21st century, it's not either or. This is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. I mean, from over here in London, as we look at America, and, there's a history of Britain looking at America and feeling sort of slightly good about ourselves, that America has all kinds of problems that we don't. But taking that aside, we are sitting here in London looking at America, looking at, as you say, people being taken off the streets and deported, looking at big business and lots of universities, until Harvard spoke up, also kind of folding over or failing to stand up, at least, to, as you say, what is kind of something totally new and certainly down the road towards autocracy. When you're in your studies, in your research, why do elites, whether that's businessmen, people in media, people in academia, lawyers, whoever, why do they tend to bend to authoritarian governments, and how does that end up for them in the end?
Yes, this has been very dispiriting. Even if you study the patterns, as I do, and I have case studies in my book. So the concept that I've worked with, which is sadly relevant now to the States, is authoritarian bargains. And this is when elites, could be business, could be academic, whatever kind of elite, economic elites, make deals with the leader. It could be when he's still running for office, and then it's kind of a bang in advance, as we saw with Jeff Bezos and the owner of the LA Times, or especially once they come in. And these authoritarian bargains are that the elites will stay silent and be loyal to the leader, no matter what he does, no matter how many idiotic and harming things he does, in return for being able to have degrees of prosperity and ability to plunder the economy without any regulation or oversight. And that indeed is what has happened, because although we usually use a political definition of authoritarianism, when the executive expands and takes over, the power of the other institutions, such as the judiciary, takes away their independence. Another way of looking at authoritarianism is that you take away the rights, or you curtail the rights of the many, voting rights, reproductive rights, but you give the very few, the oligarchs, the cronies, the huge corporate leaders, unheard of liberties, because you deregulate, you take away oversight, you take away accountability, so they can then plunder the workforce, so that weaken unions, they can plunder the environment, food safety, water safety, all of these things they can do without any penalty. So that is what is happening here. And if you look at the action of the last 100 days, there's one whole vector that is all about rolling back regulations, oversight, accountability to the benefit of all kinds of elites.
We just talked about so many aspects of this that are bad for the average voter, right? It doesn't sound like it's good. It's good for anybody, and it's horrific to look at. How many people are susceptible to authoritarianism, do you think? There's hard right parties polling at kind of 20% or more in some European countries, at the AfD in Germany, for example. Trump won close to 50% of the popular vote. Where does the kind of popular support for this top out, and how do you explain that kind of the average voter being attracted to this kind of politics?
So there's different research. One, Karen Stenner and others have said for years that about 30% of any population at any time is susceptible to authoritarian politics if the right politician or charismatic demagogue comes along. And that's because these are people who are, in a sense, already authoritarian in their private lives. Perhaps they gravitate to authoritarian style religions, hierarchies, patriarchy. It's tracked in the way they consider child rearing, education, the role of gender roles, of course. And then these people can get, activated by somebody like a Trump, who comes along and embodies politically what they already believed. So that can happen. The other thing I found in my research is, in terms of patterns, is that when a society has made a huge amount of social progress, or even groundbreaking social progress, like we had in 2016, we had 8 years of the first African-American president. We had legalized same-sex marriage. Women were admitted to combat. There were all these measures of profound social progress. And that's when Trump came on, and we had a female presidential candidate, Hillary Clinton. And Trump came up and said, "Oh no, I will fix it," and appealed to all these people who, very sadly, do not see the progresses of others in a positive light. They feel like they're losing something. And this links, so that's on the popular level, but this links to elites who perhaps know better, but they also feel they're losing something if workers' rights or other kinds of equity concerns are addressed. And so you have this backlash. And that is where the grassroots people support this fully. And that's what we've seen with the bait of immigrants. Immigrants are the same narratives over 100 years, that immigrants are coming over the border. You will lose out. You will lose safety. You will lose jobs. Or women are getting something, so men, especially white men, are losing. And these are narratives that continue over 100 years in different places, because they're very effective.
Do you see these repeat? I mean, obviously, these sound very relevant to what's happening in the US. Do you see them repeat in other states, like Turkey, for example, or Israel, or kind of other states where you're seeing that authoritarian trend?
Yes, it's different everywhere. I mean, in the Euro-American context, it's the white male or the white Christian civilization that's going to be compromised by immigrants. We saw this also with Brexit, right? My mother lives in England. She voted for Brexit, and then she regretted it later. So these are very powerful narratives, which is why they're used over and over. But the other thing that you see is kind of national purity campaigns, where you have an other which in Israel is, Palestinians, and so they must be eradicated because they represent a security threat as well as a kind of civilizational threat. And so you see different versions of what you could call great replacement theory, the idea that we have to act at the state level to protect ourselves, or our civilization will be tarnished. And in its most extreme forms, which are upheld by Giorgia Meloni in Italy, or in even in Hungary, the idea that if we don't do something about the population, then white Christian civilization will be annihilated. And this is a mainstay of the Trump administration as well, through Stephen Miller. So you have this idea that civilization itself is at risk. And this is also and it has different forms in different places in the world. But the key thing is that you've got to get people into a state of existential dread. And it's not just that it's a difference of opinion, that they're going to have politics they don't like. It's that those politics existentially threaten them, their livelihood, even their physical safety. And that is when you get people to embrace violence as an option. And sadly, we've seen this all over the world.
I wonder if we might talk a bit about the term that is the title of your 2020 book, Strongmen, and what you mean when you talk about a strong man. You've mentioned, we've talked about Erdogan, we've talked about Netanyahu as authoritarian leaders. We've also talked about Giorgia Meloni. Obviously, there's sort of slightly different gender angle there. So tell me a bit about what a strong man is for you, and what it is about them that allows them to kind of capitalize on this tendency that you've described.
Yeah, I'm glad you've asked that, because the gender, we've talked about the race part, the gender part is extremely important. So in my book, I decided to put a chapter on machismo in there, because I didn't see, there's lots of work on gender, but I didn't see work on authoritarian leaders that integrated gender concepts. And they're very important to the appeal of these demagogues. And they consciously model themselves as kind of macho men who can save the nation, who can defend the nation. And there are patterns with this too. You have Mussolini stripping off his shirt on camera, and then you fast forward to Putin, who posed for all the time without a shirt on as the defender of the nation. So they don't just represent the nation as in a democracy, they physically embody the nation. And they've been very, very smart at using the latest technology, whatever it is, whether it was back, for Hitler, the radio. Modi made himself into a hologram when he ran for office the first time in India. And they have a very intense, direct, and unmediated relationship with their followers. They use the latest technologies to appear as in a very direct way with their followers as the only man who can save the nation. So the personality cults, which they all have, there's a canon that has gone on for 100 years. They have to be the man of the people, and this is also communist as well as fascist and everything in between. But they also have to be the man above all other men, the only man who can save the nation, because strongmen do not like the idea of successors. They have to be unique. And so that's very, very important, and it continues to be important in the appeal that these people have, and why they get people to believe their lies. And in Trump's case, people stuck with him when he could have been a has-been. He lost the election. He's not young, and yet he kept his appeal, to the extent where after the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania, he had an ear bandage that he wore, and his followers wore ear bandages too. You may have seen photos of that.
Yeah.
Yes, it's incredible. And when I saw that, I thought, oh, here we are again. Because this is a measure of the kind of bonds that these strong men forge, that when something happens to them, it also happens to their followers. It's like very, very different than the democratic approach to to political celebrity even. You can have people who are very considered charismatic or handsome or whatever, but the people are not wearing ear bandages for them. It's a very different thing. Now, all that said, at the end of Strongman, in the conclusion, I said it was inevitable we would have a female version, because it's been the far right that has nurtured, whether it's Alternative for Germany or, of course, Marine Le Pen, who's now banned for corruption for running again, but, with the far right party in France. And, of course, Meloni, who in 2022 became the first female prime minister in Italy. And she's an interesting example because she's very tough. And I think she was very influenced by Mussolini in her way that she addresses the public. And she's an example of what we call gender washing, because, and Katalin Novak, who was the first president of Hungary, the same, they are breaking the glass ceiling, so to speak. They're doing things no other women did before in their countries. But the policies they're pushing, actually, their obsession with population and race, and they define themselves and female identity around motherhood. And you have value if you're a mother. You have less value if you're not a mother. So they actually push these ideas and policies that harm women in the aggregate. And so that's the gender washing. And so that's what we have today. We will probably have more far-right female leaders. Democracies seem, at least in the United States, less ready to accept a female head of state.
Can you imagine like an opposite scenario where this strongman character or strong woman in a strongman character has this appeal, but towards progressive ends? So the things that you described, that this backlash came up against and helped propel sort of Trump to power, could there be a strong man or woman who helps push that stuff along, or is it a complete contradiction in terms of strong men and progressive politics?
The whole autocratic mode of governments is qualitatively different than democratic norms and notions. The idea of governance is different for autocrats. They're not there. They don't care about public welfare, and many of them, Trump included, they don't really care if their citizens live or die. They're there to enrich themselves from office and amass power and never have to leave, all of that. But we can see the idea that Democrats should certainly take a page out of certain things of the authoritarian playbook. One of them is using emotions in politics and appealing to people in a less in a way that's less founded on liberal democratic reason, but adding a kind of emotional appeal, adding a more personalized appeal, doing things that we know resonate in the building of communities, because it's been the right that has been able to form these movements of belonging. And you don't have to give people a cap if you did this in a democratic way. And you certainly don't have to impose an authoritarian rule of no dissent, only the leader knows the truth. But you can still build movements and political communities more effectively than is being done today, by being much smarter about communication, about the narratives, about giving people hope. And it was done in Poland in 2023. I mean, they got rid of their far-right government, and they were able to have the biggest voter turnout in many decades. And they had this giant march, and it was called the March of a Million Hearts. And so it denounced corruption. It was against, the anti-humanitarian, anti-immigrant policy, but it gave people hope and used a kind of soaring emotion that we can love each other, we can have solidarity, and we can believe in our future. And I think that Kamala Harris started to do that, the hope and love and joy, and then abandoned it at the end. And I think that wasn't a good move. And so there's a lot we can actually learn from the authoritarian playbook without embracing the disenfranchising, the hatred, we can kind of learn from the structures of the way they talk to people without embracing the heinous content, I believe.
Yeah, arguably Barack Obama did a little bit of this, didn't he? When he was elected, like, yes, we can. This incredible sense of hope, a sense of
the audacity of hope,
The
the name of his memoir, of course.
Exactly, and we are going to need this because in the United States, because what we're going through, we're very early days, but the hardship and distress that is being created, I believe, by design, the economic and just every type of distress and government not working anymore. People are not going to be getting their Social Security benefits. All kinds of things are going to break down. And we will need someone who comes on the political scene and says, there is hope, we can fix this, and I will help you to do this. I will lead you.
Do you see anyone within the Democratic Party in the US who could have that potential and who could communicate in that way?
I mean, there are a lot of younger people. I mean, it's been very interesting to me to see the turnout for the 83-year-old Bernie Sanders, who's partnered with, I don't remember how old she is, but she's very young, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who they've been getting tens of thousands of people in their anti-oligarchy tour. I mean, she's an excellent communicator. And here she was blocked from having a bigger role in the Democratic Party by the much older elite who is more conservative. So they're going to have to sort this out. And I think one of the interesting things we see in our bi-party system is that we know there's less flexibility when you only have two parties. And if one party gets taken over by an autocrat, those in the party who are disaffected or kicked out have nowhere to go if they don't want to go to this other large party. So you don't have the ability, like in Poland or in Italy in 2019, to have all these different parties band together and have some crossover among them. So you block the autocrat from coming to power, or you can get rid of him later. And the Democratic Party, it seems it's not really built for a crisis. It's this giant monolith, and it's not been flexible enough. But again, it's early days, and I think people have been a bit unfair to expect this monolith giant party to know how to respond and become agile and immediately promote the best communicators and have a whole shakeup of the party hierarchy. It's starting to happen now, but it's so early, and people were trying to get the measure of what's been going on. And it's also even for me, and I study coups, and I predicted a lot of this stuff, not the Musk intrusion, but pretty much everything else. And it's shocking to me, because you can't keep track of all the things going on. And that's by design. So I believe we're going to get into a situation where the Democratic Party will have a better articulated response, but it hasn't come yet.
One of the really shocking stories watching here from London has been the kind of the detentions of migrants and immigrants, the role of ICE agents in deporting people, in detaining people. Can you explain to us what role ICE has in Trump's kind of authoritarianism? Is it, you said everything, there are things that are happening by design in terms of confusing voters with the pace of change and the pace of what's happening. Is this a sort of agency that is working kind of loyal to Trump? Is it what does it look? What is it? Is it as bad as it looks?
I put in my book, and I was writing in 2019, for the violence chapter, because every chapter goes over 100 years, and Trump was in it. What did I include? I included ICE roundups and people being put in these border camps. And I remember my editor said, well, this can't be in the States, because I was talking about doctors coming in and diagnosing torture conditions in these ICE camps, these Customs and Border Control camps, but ICE are the ones who do the roundups, and they work together, obviously. And she said, this must be in Mexico, on that side of the border. And I was like, no, there were these roundups. And it's really important to understand that what's going on now had a precedent in terms of the abuse. And people were terrified and I wrote in the book at the time, to getting the knock on the door or the police bursting in, which is a classic thing in authoritarian states. And so now we see that Trump has come back into power, and ICE is almost like, in comparative terms, it's like this kind of radical paramilitary, almost like a police force, like an SS, that is rounding up people, wearing plain clothes, though, often. And I believe what's been going on, the people who've been selected in part, this is the autocratic, sadistic game of making an example. You select certain people, and it's happened to foreign people, foreign scholars who have been detained, or the Turkish graduate student who was approached. This terrifying video, also terrifying because it's actually what Erdogan does. He goes after people who are abroad or in his country, and they come in the plain clothes and they stuff them into a van. For me, it was devastating to see that this young woman who's Turkish, who knows perfectly well that she comes from an authoritarian state, and here it's happening to her in her adopted country. And so they're acting like a classic authoritarian police or secret police force in a way, because they're in plain clothes and rounding up people. And then the innovation is that the partnership with Bukele to send people to his gulag, and with no due process. And the other part that's instructive is that the United States acknowledged that some of these people were not gang members and they've made a mistake, but they don't care, because getting those people back, here's the key thing, getting those people back and not only acknowledging they did the wrong thing, but trying to repair it, would be for autocrats a sign of weakness. The autocrat never apologizes and never does anything that would lead people to think that they care about international law, humanitarianism, or any democratic notion of decency or dignity of the individual. So there was no way that those people, even if the judge ordered them to be brought back, that too would be weakness. And so the point of the Trump administration is that it's going out of its way to telegraph, to blare with a huge horn that it is an authoritarian mentality government that is not going to be held accountable by international law, by judges, or anything that has weight and status in a democracy. And that's why it's very terrifying.
So, I mean, the question that follows this picture, which is, as you say, changing every day. There's a long way to run to the next election. So a long way to run until for the Democrats to figure out what they can do kind of in an electoral system. So the question that follows is, based on your experience and your historical study and your research that you're doing into authoritarian states today, what can be done between now and the next US election to contain this authoritarian desire of the administration? What are the levers available, whether that's other institutions of the state, Congress maybe, or kind of popular resistance? Talk a little bit about what would be the most effective kind of rebuttal.
When you have a venal and corrupt leader who really cares mostly about making money, and staying in office is a means to the end of making money, then losing the support of the big elites, the billionaires, the major bank owners, the people who are now staying silent, even through his tariff disaster, out of cowardice. If they will agree to start speaking out, that can actually have an effect. If he starts to lose, if the authoritarian bargain I spoke about before starts to unravel, that that is perhaps something that would constrain behavior. It's not guaranteed, because the whole point of these strongmen is that, sadly, the more people capitulate to them, the more they get into this state of grandiosity. And I read lots of political psychologist profiles of all these guys, and sadly, Trump fits all of them. So you surround yourself with yes people, sycophants, sometimes as family members. You get all these powerful people, whether they're senators in the GOP or bank owners or God knows who, and they all either tell you you're doing the right thing in the face of when it's patently not the right thing, like the tariffs, or they stay silent. And so you feel doubly empowered to go on your path. And you start believing your own propaganda, that you are the only man who can save the nation. Mussolini's slogan was, Mussolini's always right. At the end of Trump's campaign, he actually had a rally. Somebody had sent me this, and behind him was a sign that he put up. Trump has always been right. So that's one thing, getting the elites to peel away and perhaps change behavior. The other thing is mass nonviolent protest is very effective at the right time. Many people are starting to, kind of commentators are even starting to talk about the necessity of a general strike, which is, not something that is common in America, less common in other countries, or economic measures of making the government feel pain, and so those are the main things. Congress is very constrained because Trump is ruling through executive order, and the GOP, which has the majority, is just his personal tool, and they're supposedly afraid of their personal safety, the GOP senators and Congress people. Because he's he rules like a mafia boss. Many people have made this comparison, including Bill Emmett recently. So I think making them feel pain through strikes or boycotts, or letting him know that the elites will not support him in the future, that's probably the way to go, because these are transactional people. They don't have any real morals or values beyond power. And so if you communicate to them that power may be diminished, that's maybe the way to go.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for joining us. We ask every guest who comes on if there's anything that makes them feel either hopeful or optimistic. So following on from what you just said, is there anything that makes you feel either of those things in this very difficult, dark period?
There is actually, and I have a Substack newsletter, Lucid, and early on I started writing about all these things that sadly have come true that would happen. But I also wrote a piece that said, out of the chaos and corruption, there will be a reckoning. And one of my mantras is never underestimate the American people. And of course, that's sorely tested when they return a convicted felon to power in a free and fair election. But I believe that the magnitude of the destruction that we will see will lead to many people who had been conditioned emotionally or politically by MAGA to open their eyes and make a different choice.
Ruth, thank you so much for your time. It's been fascinating to hear from you. And thank you so much for joining the podcast today.
Thank you.
This interview was from an episode of the Prospect podcast. To listen to the episode in full, including further discussion and our weekly banger and dud section, click the link in the description below. And to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, head to prospectmagazine.co.uk.